Hey guys, it's Paul, combat veteran, MMA fighter, YouTuber, and today we are checking out a hugely fan requested video. This is Luton's Space Marine creation and recruitment. And before we get started, if you two are a little bit skeptical of a Space Marine chapter that turns into wolves, hit that subscribe button. And of course, be sure to like the video. Tell the YouTube algorithm that I am making quality content. And check out my second channel, my Instagram, and my newly created Patreon. But most important, check out my merch store. We have merch, right? I think it looks pretty cool, and it's the best way to support the channel. Okay, having done all that, let's get into it.
Iron will and steely sinew. In great armour I shall clad them, and with the mightiest weapons they shall be armed. They will be untouched by plague or disease, no sickness shall blight them. They shall have such tactics, strategies and machines that no foe will best them in battle. They are my bulwark against the terror. They are the defenders of humanity. They are my Space Marines. And they shall know no fear.
Can always count on Warhammer to be really dramatic.
Space Marines are humanity's most elite fighting force.
The Custodes would beg to differ. And maybe the Grey Knights.
They're the defenders of civilization, but their immense power is forged through a harsh selection process, extreme genetic and body modifications. This grueling transformation kills many recruits, and those who do survive it are left arguably barely human. The conversion from weak mortal to demi-godlike superhuman is one gifted to only a tiny amount of humans in the 41st millennium. And Astartes, when his transformation is complete, will be stronger, tougher, mentally more powerful by factors than an ordinary human. And while a Space Marine's prime mission is to protect humanity, their physical disparity from ordinary common humans can actually leave many Astartes to look down on these lesser common humans, while others will feel a renewed sense of dedication to protect those who can barely protect themselves. It's important to remember that Space Marines are the defenders of humanity and not the rulers of it. Humans, for better or worse, have been the leaders of the Imperium of Man until recently with the return of Primarch Roboute Guilliman. While the transformation of a human to Space Marine is complex, you'll often hear the terminology of a gene seed be used. Now, a gene seed is not literally a seed, but it is a specific organ that each Astartes carries with seed-like qualities. It's a term used to describe generally the genetic material of an Astartes. It's more accurately the cells and DNA required to engineer a human into an Astartes. The gene seed, more specifically though, refers to the Space Marines' progenoid glands, and the clue is in the name there when you think of progeny.
Okay, wow, he's really jumping straight into it. So, yeah, it's actually, again, based on, I'm going to say reality, the idea that often the defenders of the country are people who are very separate from it. This is something that the United States has had a really fraught relationship with over its history. When it was founded, the idea of a citizen army was seen as paramount, right? And this was derived in turn from ancient Greece and ancient Athens, where the idea was that citizens, and again in Greece these were male citizens, either had or did defend the country in times of war, and that their defense of the country was inseparable from their role as citizens who, through the democratic process, ruled it. This is, of course, way different from the idea of a military class or a warrior class that you saw in other, Bronze Age empires. I'm thinking of, I think it's called the Seleucid in the Iranian area, where they had an actual dedicated professional standing army who defended the empire, but didn't really participate in it, was separate from it. And as throughout the U.S. military's history and the United States history, the citizen soldier to professional soldier dynamic has waxed and waned quite a bit. You see now, for many years, you think Vietnam, you think Korea, you think the Second World War. For much of the 20th century, the military relied on conscripts. And these conscripts would serve a fixed period and then would return to their civilian lives, usually again as citizens of the country. This, of course, was also true in the Civil War, but in the period leading up to the Civil War and in the period following the Civil War, there was in fact a professional officer class and a professional military class that in a lot of ways was out of sight, out of mind of the general public. And of course, in the modern United States, the military, a lot of people believe, has never been more insular. They say actually that the modern military, there's so many parents and children and grandchildren that serve that it's considered in many cases hereditary. There's some articles you can see where they talk about a warrior caste. And, anecdotally, this is true. I know a lot of the soldiers, the officers that I served with, had parents who were or had been active duty military. My father was not, but my brother was an Army officer on active duty and is still an officer in the Army Reserve. So again, it's something that has sort of waxed and waned, and now we are probably in, for the United States, one of the peaks of the professional soldiering class. And when you live on separate military bases and you live in separate, you live a separate military life, right? You're sort of insulated from the ups and downs of the economy, but you're exposed to, in a very visceral way, the ups and downs of national security. I would sort of half joke with people, I went on active duty in 2009, that I was able to completely bypass the, 2008 recession, where I would have never been able to get a job as a fresh out of undergrad kid. But I went right onto active duty, was making a good professional salary with excellent benefits. But, of course, I had to deal instead with the surge in Iraq, which was ending, and the surge in Afghanistan that I was participating in. So again, you get this warrior class that has a real sense of separateness from their civilian counterparts.
These organs in a Space Marine respond to the other genetic implants they have and replicate DNA. Essentially, they are, in a manner of speaking, an asexual form of reproduction, which is why when a Space Marine is fatally wounded on a battlefield, an apothecary will fight to recover his gene seed. It's also why, yes, Space Marines do not require heterosexual reproduction. 5 years from implantation, a Space Marine's neck progeny glands can be harvested, but the chest glands won't be harvested up until 10 years. Space Marines essentially depend on themselves to produce new Marines for the chapter. Lastly, in this general sphere of discussion, to answer a very commonly discussed topic, are Space Marines actually castrated? And then, how do they excrete waste? Well, I can't actually recall anywhere in written law this being noted, so if anybody has a specific point of reference, please do link it. But my speculation, based on a few things that I've kind of looked at, is that pretty much the canon opinion is that Space Marines have no sexual drive. However, when it comes to excretion, it's true that their armour is also an environment suit that would cycle and process their own waste, much like a still suit in the Dune universe. Also, Space Marines do not live in their armour, although they may wear it for extended periods of time. It can be removed. It's entirely possible that their external genitals are removed and they have implants to take care of waste, but I've got nothing to see that it points towards.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting to think, like, okay, so the Space Marines, first off, are they, I need the lore experts to weigh in, so are they connected? Obviously, they're intimately familiar and in a lot of ways connected with their armor, but in a biological way. Does the armor interface directly with their internal organs? And that, to me, would be an important answer to that question, right? Because I think of, hey, you're a space marine, you're cut off, maybe your power armor is really damaged to the point where you need to strip it off. If you were to do so, would that space marine be able to continue to fight? And if they require implants, even in the modern world, we have things like catheters and ostomy bags, right, for people who can't excrete waste conventionally or through the normal biological mechanism. But those people can't often survive for long periods of time without those waste excretion devices. And if Marines needed that, they would be unable to survive for more than potentially a couple of days or maybe a week or two outside of their power armor, which seems silly for a combat unit, right? Why would you have a combat unit be completely helpless, especially something as strong and capable as a Space Marine sans armor? Why would you have it be crippled by the fact that you would remove their genitals, which you didn't need to remove because if you took care of their sex drive, then why would you mess with it? But probably for the same reason you made them 8 feet tall.
This. So it's an unknown, but it's not something that's critically really important in the scheme of things. It's equally possible that it's just seen as an organ as with everything else and they just leave it all be. Now, before we look further into how a Space Marine is forged in the 41st millennium, let's remind ourselves how they were created over history. Now, the first form of Space Marine was originally created by the Emperor during the Unification Wars of the late 30th millennium. Earth at this time was a barren wasteland of scavengers and barbaric warring tribes after civilization had imploded as a result of the Age of Strife. Earth, being cut off from its supply routes in the warp, cannibalized itself and fell into total anarchy. After the Emperor originally created techno-barbarians, a crude adapted form of super soldier, he would form them later into the Thunder Warriors. These warriors were brutal, powerful, and most importantly, highly unstable. The Emperor knew that he wouldn't be able to work with these soldiers forged in the fires of anarchy beyond the unification of Earth's warring tribes, and so he secretly constructed his genetic facilities in a fortress deep below vast mountain ranges on Earth. Here, he would, with some few remaining gene rights, create his Primarchs using his own genetic material as a template. Then subsequently, the very first of the new breed of warriors, the Space Marines, or Astartes. But
again, I feel like the Custodies should show up here at some point, and they have yet to. Yeah, I mean, it's funny that they talk so much about genetic stability, and here's sort of the interesting context is, in the 90s, they had what we call the Human Genome Project, right? It was the first time that we were able to sequence every single amino acid of DNA in a human being. And it was believed at one point that doing so would enable us to unlock the secrets of all of human biology, right? It would be like all of the instructions for a human being would be laid out in front of us protein by protein. But when we got it, it was like the manual wasn't long enough for everything a human body does. And so we realized, we're like, there's unwritten rules, so to speak, of DNA, right? There's things that the DNA produces. It'll produce protein X and protein Y or whatever. But there's other interactions that those proteins do with one another, other interactions that happen outside of a genetic mandate that have a tremendous influence on how human beings operate. And things like personality, things like temperament, things like in some ways like types of intelligence and types of thinking and outlook. Those things are all really, we know that there's some genetic like markers that can tell us, hey, we think this person's might be prone to bipolar disorder, for example. But it doesn't predict it. There's people that get bipolar disorder that don't have any of those markers. There's people with all of those markers that don't and manifest. There's people with non-clinical like personality types that have all the markers. It's not one-to-one. And so it definitely would make sense that there would be what they call instability, but just genes, you start playing with genes to get certain traits, and it messes with other parts of the process down the line.
What are the Thunder Warriors? Imperial records state that the Thunder Warriors were nearly all wiped out during a particularly bloody battle at the end of the Unification Wars on Mount Ararat. Conveniently, the new Legiones Astartes were created readily to replace them. Now, records from this time are understandably fragmented, but described eyewitness accounts from the few Thunder Warriors to survive this battle, like Arcturnus, stated that it was in fact the Emperor himself who massacred the Thunder Warriors. Others have stated that it was also in collaboration with his custodian guard. In several instances that occurred since this time where Thunder Warriors have appeared and faced their Astartes brothers, the Thunder Warriors have nearly always managed to inflict casualties beyond expectation before they are finally felled. This gives some indication of how powerful they were as warriors, and why the Emperor felt they were perhaps too dangerous, given their power and psychological instability, to function as a disciplined fighting and defensive force for the new Imperium. Regardless, this whole situation is a dark and little...
Again, in human beings, and we've discussed this with some of the very violent assassination specific orders in the Imperium, but you really make some serious trade-offs when you select for people who commit wanton violence, right? High levels of violence or violence for pleasure, and it's not even necessarily like being a psychopath or a sociopath, right? Because the classic psychopath is someone who doesn't really respond to, and again, let me know if I'm getting these backwards, but a psychopath is someone who won't really respond, who doesn't feel like particular emotions around shame or negativity, right? So they'll manipulate a person. They won't care if violence is done to them, but they won't seek it out. They won't actively cultivate violence. They won't cultivate fighting. And you see this sometimes in people who have had like a lot of trauma or have been raised in environments that are really, really violent, is that they'll only respond to sometimes routine occurrences by instantly launching into violence. And it's really not a way to function in a society. You really can't function in a society when you're trying to fight cashiers, when you're trying to fight social workers, hospital staff, right? And this is the sort of environment that you see these types of people, unfortunately, often end up in. So it would make sense, of course, that the Emperor would mean well. He would select for people who were very aggressive, very violent, true conquerors at heart, and would accidentally create people who look more like trauma victims, we'll say. And I can imagine that having to spend multiple lifetimes conquering Earth through battle after battle, that's going to affect you. I mean, think about how much even healthy, pretty resilient adults deal with combat, like being exposed to combat at war. They fare pretty poorly. So you can only imagine how lifetime after lifetime of conflict would affect someone who is already predisposed to violence, right? So it would make sense that the Emperor would actually try to dial it down in the Astartes, and maybe select for what sounds like righteous violence, or like the sense of like a willingness to do violence in the name of your ideology. And maybe that comes from a different place. I'm sure it does in lore, but I'd be curious if science could ever answer that question, if all violence stems from the same place in a person's mind, or if violence's duty is different from like the white-hot rage of violence.
Spoken of episode for the Emperor of Man. Vocalizing these events would no doubt have some Inquisition or ecclesiarchy on their way to you very promptly. With the Thunder Warriors killed in the Battle of Mount Ararat, the new Space Marines, the Legiones Astartes, would come to the fore. Unlike their Thunder Warrior forebears, they would undergo rigorous mental training as well as physical and genetic modifications. This would give them immense physical traits as well as being near unbreakable with their mental conditioning.
Yeah, of course. And as we discussed, that is so essential, right? Because you can build combat skills, you can build you can't build power, or you can build power armor, actually. You can build combat skills, right? But you can't build necessarily the ability to engage in warfare, engage in violence, see your friends hurt, killed, maimed, and then go back home or go back to whatever, and then do it all over again and never lose your discipline, never lose your cool, never lose your functionality. Again, we talk about how long can an Astartes live. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of years of horrific violence. The ability to prevent that from taking a toll on the psyche. Again, that is almost one of the most hand-wavy, fantastical parts of Warhammer 40k.
The new Marines were initially segregated into 20 legions. This separation was not for simple organizational purposes. Each legion was imbued with genetic traits from their Primarch, and as such this impacted their character and behavior. To ensure unity, the Emperor designated them to stay together in their legions to reduce friction and ensure cohesion of the Astartes brothers. Through recruiting and conquest of human colonies, as the Imperium expanded, so did the Astartes legions. What had begun as a handful of Marines swelled to tens of thousands during the Crusades. This would lead later to heavy damage caused during the heresy, after the Primarchs holding such immense power, being the sole commanders of each Space Marine legion. After that period of chaotic incursion, Roboute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, would draft the Codex Astartes, and the remaining loyalist Primarchs would, after much consideration, agree at best that the Space Marine legions be split into chapters. This was to ensure no Space Marine legion could wield the sheer weight of power they had during the Crusades and subsequent heresy.
That is actually completely realistic and definitely drawn from history. Very, very common. Again, not so much to prevent coups. A good example is actually the French Republic. The military, I think it was in the 50s, the military, so France fought a brutal guerrilla war in Algeria immediately following their defeat in Vietnam, or what they called Indochina. And this guerrilla war that they fought and ultimately lost in Algeria caused so much domestic strife, right? Because at the time, Algeria was seen as a state intrinsic to France, in the same way that Alaska or Hawaii are intrinsic states to the U.S. And as a result, of course, of some of the willingness by the French government to negotiate and some other sort of policy decisions, the French Republic, the French military, the Foreign Legion actually, among them, became so infuriated that they actually staged a coup, and they did a airborne drop onto Paris, which is completely insane to think about. Again, in the modern era, in the 50s, in a place like post-war France. But to prevent that, of course, the after the coup was sort of defeated, that was replaced. They ensured that there wouldn't be continued threats of a coup by sort of dispersing the military command a lot more, reducing the size of certain elements, and sending a lot of them far overseas, right? That's why the French Foreign Legion has a lot of bases either in rural France or overseas. And that's not by accident. That's to keep them and the other parts of the military from getting a little too enthusiastic when they get upset with the way things are going.
This was known as the Second Founding. Each of these chapters would take a permanent homeworld or fortress monastery in the Imperium. The Codex Astartes states that each chapter would be 1,000 battle brothers in number and manage its own recruitment. A specific development in the creation of a Space Marine was discovered after the Horus Heresy.
I just want to point out that giving an entire planet for 1,000 people is like preposterous.
Weaknesses in the gene seed. Now, as I previously explained, the gene seed is the core biological component in the creation of a Space Marine. During the Heresy, Space Marines were created on a massive scale, and as with any biological replication process, if you do this on a large scale, then mutations and errors can occur in this DNA replication. So another result of the implementation of the Codex Astartes by Guilliman was to slow the process of creating a Space Marine, to more closely monitor their genetic material and the material implanted within new recruits to ensure purity and expunge defects. Guilliman would also establish core genetic banks on Terra to ensure a stock of genetics existed. These pure sources would provide new material for the foundings of Astartes chapters and also prevent any further contamination.
So, believe it or not, it's actually pretty common to see these sort of things happen. In in the modern world, we see certain subsets of populations are somewhat more prone to certain genetic conditions. I want to say it's like anemia or sickle cell is really common among like Askanzi Jews, I think. Like a very, very specific subset. Cystic fibrosis. Sorry. Okay, interesting. Right. This says, this is from University of Maryland Health. 1 in 4 people of Ashkenazi Jewish heritage is a carrier of one of these genetic conditions: Gaucher disease, cystic fibrosis, Tay-Sachs. Interesting. Tay-Sachs, familial dysautonomia, and caravan disease. Which is fascinating. Which is fascinating because, again, you're talking about a very, 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 very narrow subset of human beings, but through years and years and years of sort of, again, this is in like prehistory, from being insular and isolated, those genes tend to become more prominent. And again, the other classic example is hemophilia among European royalty. Classic, like, just genetic disorder that you have recessive genes sort of interbreeding, and you end up with those genes appearing more frequently. I don't know if I've ever heard of genes like digressing or like destabilizing over time. I don't know about that, but it's interesting for sure. Okay, guys, so we are actually at a logical stopping point. I'm going to stop it there. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you guys got something out of this. This is really fascinating so far, and I can't wait to look at the recruitment cycle. Really curious to see how that lines up with modern military recruitment. But thank you guys for watching, and until next time, I will see you guys later.